Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to the New Books Network. I'm Stephen Pimpare, host of the Public Policy Channel, and we are joined today by Ann Kim, who is the author of Poverty for Profit: How Corporations Get Rich Off America's Poor, from the New Press. Ann, thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
So if you want, I wonder if you might start by telling folks just a little bit about who you are and what you do and what brought you to this particular project.
Yeah, sure. I guess you could say I've had kind of a checkered career. I'm a contributing editor at Washington Monthly Magazine, but before that, I was a staffer on the Hill for a House congressman. I worked in nonprofits. I worked in think tanks. And way back in the day, I was also a corporate lawyer. I spent 6 years doing big law. And kind of all of that background together, I think kind of gives me this sort of insider's perspective on how politics, policy, and business all kind of intersect. And I hope to bring all those perspectives into the book that I wrote. So
Okay.
as far as, yeah.
There is, it seems to me, sort of a counterintuitive truth that sits at the very heart of the book, which is that there's a lot of money to be made off of poor people. So I wonder if you might sort of just lay out sort of the broader argument, and then maybe we can look at some of the specific ways in which that happens in practice.
Sure. So the federal and state local governments all spend quite a bit of money every year on programs that either, directly or disproportionately impact low-income Americans in some way. A lot of that is, programs that do deliver benefits to low-income Americans. Medicaid, health insurance program for the poor, being the biggest one, but also, welfare payments, supplemental nutrition assistance program, formerly known as, food stamps, housing subsidies, job training programs. There's a host of other initiatives that's kind of developed over time. And then there's spending on programs, I guess, that are poverty adjacent. Foster care, child welfare programs, for instance. Unfortunately, the justice system disproportionately impacts low-income Americans. So you add up all that spending, and just on the benefit piece of it, we're talking about $900 billion a year. Most of that is Medicaid, but that is a lot of money.
Even in an economy our size, that's real money, right?
That's right. And that's not even including the state spending or the local spending, because there's supplemental spending, on top of that to, add on to the federal government programs that are out there.
So why don't we walk through some of the particular policies and programs that you highlight in the book? Why don't we start by talking about something that folks may be a little familiar with because it's been in the news a bit lately, tax preparation, right?
Yeah.
So how is there money to be made there?
Sure. I talk about a few kind of baskets of poverty profiteers throughout the book, and tax preparation is a very straightforward example of an industry that's really kind of glommed on to the vast amounts of money that flow to low-income people at tax time. One of the federal government's largest anti-poverty programs is the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a refundable, meaning that you get the tax credit even if you don't have tax liability, and it goes to working poor taxpayers. But the credit itself is really pretty complicated to figure out. There's a 44-page instruction manual. There's all sorts of different qualifying criteria. Most people have to go to a professional tax preparer to get access to that benefit. And that's where the tax prep industry has come in. If you walk around any low-income neighborhood, you'll see these kind of mom and pop shops that pop up at tax time, but you've also got these big national chains that take advantage of this as well. And we're talking about a $57 billion market in earned income tax credit. That's what was returned to taxpayers back in 2022. These tax prep companies will charge hundreds of dollars to prepare the return, and oftentimes they'll charge even more in fees to offer kind of fast cash, easy advance refund products so people can walk out the door with cash in hand. Or on other products. One example I give in the book about kind of this partnership some tax preparers have with other industries is with a buy now, pay here used car dealership. So we call it this car dealership in Arkansas, Rogers Car Mart. And what they'll do for me, what they said they would do for me, is put together my tax return, which will cost a couple $100, and they can offer me the advance like right away, which I can spend on a down payment for a car. So the idea is that I could potentially walk out of there with $0 in my pocket, but a used car. And there are mobile home dealerships that do this, check cashiers. There's all sorts of industries that kind of glom on to this benefit at X time, and the effect is to really diminish the impact of this benefit for low-income families.
I'm fairly well keyed into this. I had no idea about the links with the car dealership places. That's just adding a level of horror onto what we already knew were incredibly exploitative and extractive processes. I guess if there's money to be made, people are going to find a way to do it. So you mentioned earlier the amount of money that goes into the cash welfare program. Used to be AFDC, is now TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the transitions that's taken place since welfare reform in the 1990s, what those programs look like now, and how they are administered, and by whom, and who's getting that money?
Yeah, sure. So this is a really interesting story that kind of takes us back into kind of like this broader philosophical evolution in how government is administered, right? So back in the day, Aid to Families of Dependent Children was a federal entitlement program, and the federal government just cut checks, right? And then that created a lot of problems with conservative arguments about it, promoting dependency, blah, blah, blah. So you had this strain of conservative thought around welfare, quote unquote, reform. At the same time, with the Reagan Revolution, you had President Ronald Reagan coming in with a bunch of conservatives who were saying that businesses can do a better job of running government programs than government can. So he made a couple of really concerted efforts to privatize, outsource government services to contractors. His commission in 1988 put out a report saying we should privatize prisons, we should privatize air traffic control, welfare. Just about anything that could be privatized, they recommended it could. And a lot of that actually has come to pass. All of this comes to a head in 1996 when welfare reform actually does pass. And here you see a meeting of these two strains of thought. First, the 1996 welfare law transforms the federal entitlement of checks to families into block grants that are given to states to administer as they see fit. And the idea is to allow states to innovate and do interesting things with this money, including giving welfare benefits to families directly. But that's not all that states were entitled to do. The second thing that the law did that impacts what we're talking about here is it removed a federal prohibition on the ability of states to outsource particular functions related to welfare programs, especially specifically like eligibility, intake, the actual processing of benefits, that kind of thing. Those needed to be state functions initially, but now with welfare reform, the state could contract those out to private companies if they wanted to, and they did. So in the book, I mentioned that within a month of President Bill Clinton signing welfare reform legislation, there was this gigantic three-way bidding war for a contract in Texas for like a $500 billion contract to run the Texas welfare system. And that contract, that bidding war was between Electronic Data Systems, that's the company that Ross Perot founded, a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin, and Anderson Consulting. So these companies swooped in very fast, and now we have pretty much, all these decades later, a completely privatized welfare system. The Texas welfare system is in the hands of a private company that runs everything, soup to nuts. And private companies run most welfare systems in most states.
And I assume the result is that we've reduced poverty and many of those resources are going into the hands of low-income families and everything's terrific, right?
Oh, yeah, obviously. Yeah, so the predictions of the Reaganites were completely wrong.
Yeah.
And if you just, Google welfare contractors and fraud or welfare contractors and lawsuits, and you'll get gazillions of hits. A lot of these companies, there aren't very many of them. So they basically have an oligopoly on running these systems. They don't always do it efficiently. They don't always do it honestly. And because of the hollowing out of governmental infrastructure over the decades, because of this push toward privatization, there's not a lot of oversight or accountability also. So you have a lot of contractors run wild and not too many consequences for bad behavior sometimes.
Yeah. This is, I think this is really important for folks. I mean, when you hear about sort of welfare fraud, we think about the image that Reagan himself portrayed, right? The individual who is, right, using multiple names and multiple addresses. That happens. It's exceedingly, exceedingly rare. Most of the fraud that happens, and we can talk about this when we talk about Medicaid, is actually large corporations or governments, right, that are falsifying records in order to increase the amount of money that they're getting, right? And I think that's really important when we hear people talking about fraud, that who's actually committing that fraud. The other thing I think worth highlighting, and I'm going to get these numbers slightly wrong, but that under AFDC, something like 80% of every dollar spent actually went into a poor and low income household, right, as cash benefits. That number is now down to, I want to say 25%, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, and in some states, it's even less than that. And in the book, I mentioned that in Michigan, because there's so much flexibility under TANF to use the money as they see fit. In Michigan, one of the researchers there found that the welfare money was going towards scholarships for affluent high schoolers, completely divorced from the original purpose, either spirit or intent of law. So yeah, most of that money is getting diverted, and very little of it is going toward low-income families.
So I mentioned Medicaid. So to talk to us a little bit about who is profiting off of poor and low-income people needing services through Medicaid programs.
Yeah, sure. So these guys fell into a kind of a second bucket of poverty industrialists, so to speak, and people who kind of indirectly benefit from the government aid. The taxpayers directly benefit. Medicaid providers kind of indirectly benefit. You have cottage industries providers who really kind of specialize in providing care, you want to call it that sometimes, to Medicaid patients. And I focus on dentistry in particular in the book, because there are problems with, regular dentists wanting to take on Medicaid patients. So, and part of it is because the reimbursement rates for Medicaid are very low.
Really low.
You have this little industry that's popped up, maybe not so little industry that's popped up, of dental franchises that predominantly serve Medicaid patients, and their business model is volume, because the Medicaid reimbursements are low. So what they've done is create a model where you have as many patients as possible and as many procedures per patient, because that's how Medicaid pays, not necessarily by outcome, as in the healthiness, the oral health of the patients, but by how many fillings did you do? How many root canals did you do? So naturally, this model lends itself to some dentists abusing the system. And the book chronicles quite a few investigations, prosecutions of dentists who performed dozens of baby root canals, for instance, or fillings on baby teeth. And in some cases, using restraints that are called papoose boards to strap down a child so that they can endure these multiple procedures at one time. In fact, the state of Colorado ended up banning papoose boards because of Medicaid dentists who were strapping down children in these contraptions so that they can perform multiple procedures on a child who may not have needed those procedures in the first place.
Talk to us a little bit about dialysis centers as well, if you would.
Yeah, and this is yet another strain of poverty profiteers. They're kind of poverty adjacent, right? Their clientele is disproportionately low income because kidney disease, kidney failure disproportionately strikes low income and minority patients because of generations of inequitable access to healthcare. So these healthcare disparities have resulted in high rates of kidney disease in poor neighborhoods. And so if you map where dialysis centers are located, you will see that they are disproportionately located in low-income and minority communities. Medicare pays for the majority of dialysis treatments in America. It is the only disease state that is entitled to be paid through Medicare. There are two private companies, Fresenius and DaVita, that provide the majority. They have kind of a duopoly, the majority of dialysis treatments in the United States. And you can look up where their clinics are. You can see where they're located. And again, just like with the Medicaid context, they pay per treatment. Now, there are some examples. There are some experiments to try to change the model a little bit, but predominantly right now, it's still per treatment. So you can imagine, again, that dialysis is a volume business. And in the book, I write about ways in which dialysis industry kind of writ large, along with the nephrologists who work for them, have occasionally steered patients with kidney failure away from, say, a life-saving transplant toward dialysis, because, you can basically milk a dialysis patient for some years. Whereas with a transplant, you lose that patient, so to speak. And if you look at transplant rates, it is much higher among the higher income and white people than among low-income minorities. And this may be one reason. And I do document some instances where it appears to be the case where there is a steering of certain patients toward dialysis and away from transplant, which is a much better option for most people if they're early on in their kidney disease.
So you made reference earlier to the criminal legal system and efforts at privatization and profit seeking from prisons. Can you talk a little bit about those systems and the ways in which they serve to effectively extract money from poor low-income folks? And as you made reference to earlier, of course, because it's the United States, when we're talking about poor and low-income people, we are inevitably disproportionately talking about communities and people of color.
Yeah. This is the group of industries that are poverty adjacent, but also helped along in a lot of ways by the state, because the state administers a justice system, but it has basically either purposely or inadvertently created opportunities for these companies to thrive. A couple strands of this. So first, there are the private prisons, companies themselves, where the states have decided to outsource the construction and maintenance and administration of prisons to private companies, some of which are public and do very, very well. You can look them up in public filings to see how they're doing. Many states also have cash bail, and that has enabled the rise of the bail bonds industry, which takes advantage of poor defendants who cannot afford to get themselves out of jail. And again, this is the burden that falls disproportionately on low-income people, because if you're wealthy, you can get yourself out of jail. What the bail bondsmen don't say is that regardless of what happens to you, you owe the bail bondsman. So in the book, I talk about a man who was innocent. He was acquitted within half an hour because of these trumped up charges when he happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. We're talking about the police in Baltimore. But he still owed the bail bondsman several $1,000s to get himself out of jail for a crime that he was completely innocent of. But that's the price and the state was okay with that, right? Maryland has since switched to a private detention model instead of cash bail, but guess who has to pay for the detention? Yes, a new crop of companies that have taken over. And then there's a third group of industries that operate within the prisons themselves. You want to talk to your family, you got to have a private company arrange those phone calls or video calls. You want entertainment, private company will provide that. Commissary, there's just a whole, whole coterie of cottage industries that are existing primarily just to serve the prison population and to extract as much money from prisoners' families, as possible.
And, for folks listening who may not have friends or relatives who are involved with the system, those services do not come cheap. It's not as because those have been farmed off to the private sectors that those incarcerated folks or others are getting a good deal, right?
Right. And in some instances, the state gets a cut of the revenues from either commissary sales or phone calls or whatever. So it's definitely in the state's interest to bring in these companies, and it's in the state's interest to let these companies charge what they want because they will get it.
Before I ask you to sort of give us some hope here and talk about what it is that you think that we can do about this, there are a number of other issues you walk through in the book. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit. Talk to us about Dollar General stores and the SNAP program, what we used to call food stamps.
Yeah, so that's another example of that first category of industries that kind of indirectly benefit from government benefits. And there are 39 million people in America, according to the USDA, who live in so-called food deserts, low-income areas with low access to supermarkets. And so what they have instead are dollar stores that have very few fresh food options, very few healthy options. I talk about going to one actually in a rural area, and the healthy choices aisle had granola bars, which are, the ultimate ultra processed.
It's candy bar, right?
Food. It's basically, yes, that's right. It's basically a candy bar. And even, companies like Walmart have a lot of exposure, according to the Wall Street Journal, to SNAP. Huge amount of their revenues come from that. So the subsidies we provide to low-income Americans to buy food for themselves are actually propping up the revenues of not just Walmart, but bodegas, dollar stores, lots of places that are not doing low-income people any favors by providing very few healthy options, and most of it high sodium, high fat, high sugar, foods that worsen health disparities even in these communities. Yeah. That's true for the school lunch program as well. Pizza Hut and Domino's have specially formulated pizza doughs that meet federal nutrition standards. So the Pizza Hut E Plus pizza program has 51% whole white wheat flour or something like that. It's still pizza. Yeah. It's still pizza. So you have everybody, taking advantage of government money. And
of course, that brings us right back to creating people to feed into those dialysis centers, right?
Yes. Yeah. So it is right. This entire kind of self-contained system in a way. And there's a huge amount of incentive because there's so much money flowing to these companies to kind of keep things the way they are. And you haven't asked about this yet, but there is a fair amount in the book about the efforts that some of these industries make to maintain the status quo by lobbying, by promoting legislation that directly serves their interests. Prison companies come into mind, for that kind of thing, or just providing subpar products that had that effect that you talk about of kind of helping poverty persist or helping the consequences of poverty persist as well.
So that I feel like that's a perfect way to sort of bring us to conclusion here is that you point out that one of the troubles that we face is that the folks who are profiting off of these often very vulnerable populations are rich and powerful and have enormous influence in the political system. And by and large, there aren't a whole lot of super effective advocates that work on behalf of poor and low income people. No disrespect to the folks who are doing that in the field, but they're just outmatched and outgunned. So given all of that, what do you recommend that we do about it? What kinds of solutions can you see available to us?
Yeah, I mean, we live in a really polarized time. And I do feel like the debate over poverty has been stuck for quite some time.
Yeah.
On the left, it's always about the resources, and on the right, it's about blaming the poor, something that you've written about yourself in your book, in your writings. And perhaps it's naive, but one of the goals of writing this particular book was to say, look, there's potentially another reason why maybe we're not making as much progress on poverty as we like. And it is this, group of industries that have gotten very little scrutiny, actually. And so that first step actually is to shine the light on who are these companies? We don't actually even know. We don't have a census of who all is out there, how much money are they extracting, what is their impact. What I've assembled is stuff that I've done or stuff that I've found, but there has never been any sort of concerted effort to look at this particular problem of privatization plus poverty, profiteering, and then thinking about, well, how do we reimagine how programs are administered, regulated, and what about some of these companies themselves that make all of their money from, public dollars? they operate with little accountability, except to shareholders, I guess. Are there new structures that we can put into place to make this whole set of industries much more transparent about how they're using taxpayer dollars without any government accountability so far?
You're listening to the Public Policy Channel of the New Books Network, and we have been speaking with Ann Kim, who's the author of Poverty for Profit, How Corporations Get Rich Off America's Poor, new out from the New Press. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.